Let me just start off by saying that people have large misconceptions of the book. Machiavelli is often quoted line, "Anyone compelled to choose will find greater security in being feared than in being loved," in page 66, sometimes misinterpreted to suggest that a prince need not to worry about public opinion. But Machiavelli explicitly argues the contrary. It is critical that a prince must avoid the hatred of his subjects, according to his advice on page 73. The statement, in fact, is less radical than it seems. People, says Machiavelli, are just simply self-interested to a certain degree. Machiavelli also characterizes the use of cruelty as evil. In some cases, cruelty is a necessary evil, and using it can be justified in the interests of a greater public good, like internal stability or protection from invasion. Yet Machiavelli's very recognition of the intrinsic immorality of cruel behavior simply contradicts the depiction of the book The Prince as a completely amoral book. It is simply just a bit pragmatic. The Prince was published in the historical background of the Renaissance. Renaissance, or rebirth, is a period in European history characterized most notably by humanism and secularism. The Renaissance was an age of recovery from the calm 14th century, a time of slow progress of recovering from the effects of Black Death, political disorder, and economic recession. This was accompanied by a rediscovery of classics and an emphasis on individual ability. In this background, the modern diplomatic system was born. Contrary to the Middle Ages, when residential ambassadors were an agent for the church and for peace, the concept of ambassador evolved to being an agent only of the territorial state that sent him. An ambassador was now an agent only of the territorial state that sent him, and not the larger body of the church. During the Italian Wars, this practice spread to the rest of Europe and is the composing background of the diplomatic system that we have in the world today. Depiction of princes in literature shifted over time. In the medieval times, they aimed to basically achieve a mirror of the accomplished prince in a non-static manner. There were increasing emphasis of religious significance and enlarging the scope by adopting the concept of prince as the governing body of a living body. By the end of 13th century, with the impact of the political doctrine of Aristotle, they tried to embrace the whole field of political institutions. And in the medieval times, they also believed that the prince connects God and man, and that prince's goal should be developing those qualities in himself that fit him to fulfill his religious functions, which are essentially Christian princely ethics. Humanists, on the other hand, abandoned religious motives. They pursued fame. But what is important to note here is that purely worldly virtues just simply took the places of the religious one and even superseded them in the degree of interest, still in a traditional idealistic manner. They founded arguments on historical examples and attempted to discover the ideal prince. The Quattrocento idea of prince still based on peaceful and fundamentally unrealistic values, administration of justice, and the maintenance of peace. A notable humanist writer, Platina, wrote that the problem of state administration are considered in relation to ethos, to a certain extent as practical examples of application of virtues. In the humanist times, such literature consisted also no more than catalogues of virtues. Just that the explanation lies in the influence of the classical world, not the religious one. The idealistic conception remained unchanged by this time, and there is still no manifestation of a thoroughgoing realism, no appreciation of the power factor and the egoism purposes that dominated the de facto political life at the time. Machiavelli's writings and the humanist literatures do share some similar parts. Both focus on the fact that the determining factor in politics was the prince's personality, and that the virtues and characteristics of the prince ought not to be different from those of a private citizen. But it is still important to note that humanism did not really pave the way for Machiavelli, who nevertheless incorporated in his book certain intellectual trends which had been already developed by humanists. Machiavelli basically developed certain distinctive features of his writing. So first of all traces of idealized human personality as such vanished from Machiavelli's portrait of the prince, and its place was taken by superpersonal conception of the reasons of the state. The theme of the book, The Prince, is that the prince is not a dependent member of a given moral order, but as a creative political man, which later became known as the idea of absolutism, akin to Louis XIV's Le État c'est moi, basically, which means that I am the state. And there also appears to be no doubt that Machiavelli did not merely refute the idealistic interpretation of politics in general, but also he wrote with the conscious aim of discrediting the idealized conception of the prince as contained in the catalogues of virtues that were typically published in his time. So, who is Machiavelli and why is he so significant? Machiavelli. No one gave a better expression to the Renaissance preoccupation with political power than Niccolo Machiavelli. He entered the service of the Florentine Republic in 1498, 4 years after the Medici family had been expelled from the city. As a secretary to the Florentine Consul 10, he made numerous diplomatic missions, including trips to France and Germany, and he saw the workings of statecraft at first hand. Machiavelli's political activity occurred during the period of tribulation and devastation for Italy that followed the French invasion in 1494. In 1512, French defeat and Spanish victory led to the establishment of the Medici power in Florence. Republicans, including Machiavelli, were sent away, forced off to give up politics. In this despair, when Machiavelli was forced to give up politics, which was the greatest love of his life, Machiavelli now reflected on his political power and wrote books, including The Prince and many others. His book, The Prince, received different reception along different historical times. The book received an enormous success d'escandale at the time of the publication. During modern times, the book was considered the objective study of his time, but in the relatively close few decades, interpretations were also raised. For example, that it is not an accurate representation of his time, noting that it contains some unrealistic advices, such as that in one chapter, he suggests that firearms are unimportant in war. The Prince is composed of chapters relatively short that each has its own lesson. The beginning of the book basically introduces his classification of the different types of states and how to best govern each of them. On to chapter 15 is the part that begins an entirely new section, transitioning from the interconnected ideas. We must rather assume the second part of the Prince consists of several distinct complexes of ideas loosely grouped together. In chapters 1 to 5, Machiavelli introduces the types of principalities and how to govern them. Machiavelli introduces his classification of the states, mainly into 1. Principalities, and 2. Republics. Principalities which can be achieved with either fortune or strength, and either with his own army with the arms of others. Machiavelli then subdivides the big category of principalities into 3 main subdivisions. First, hereditary principalities, which are easier to govern, because 1. Those under the rule of such states are accustomed to the rule by the prince's family, and 2. Natural disposition of subjects in a hereditary state is to love the ruling family. The second subdivision is new principalities, which include completely new ones and new additions to existing states. Machiavelli introduces that this poses more of a challenge. Because one, there's the expectation of improvement of people, which induces people to take up arms against the unestablished prince. And two, he'll find himself in a tricky situation with regards to his allies. And the third subdivision, ecclesiastical principalities, regions under the control of the Catholic Church. These require immense fortune and prowess for conquest. These principalities are sustained by a higher power, and religious principles rule the people rather than rulers and administrations. He then goes on to republics and mentions that it can be taken over by 1. Devastation, 2. Personal residential occupation, and 3. Charging taxes and establishing oligarchies. He mentions that complete destruction is the most certain way of securing a state that has been free in the past. A prince who does not take this route places himself in a position to be destroyed himself, much better off destroying or personally occupying the conquered state. Machiavelli then goes on to discuss the 2 ways of governance in a principality. 1. Through nobles, and 2. Through appointed ministers. He concludes, prince is regarded much stronger if he uses ministers, because it is much harder to take over a country if a prince uses ministers, as ministers will not have an incentive to be corrupted by foreign powers or to turn on their prince. They'd also not be able to gain public support as they hold no personal loyalties. He also notes, governance is much easier if the people share the same languages and customs with the rulers. In this case, rulers should only focus on 2 things: destroying the formal prince and maintaining the principality's laws and taxes. On the other hand, difference in language and customs from those of the prince and those of the people likely would pose a problem. The most effective solution for this would be for the prince to take up the residence in the new state, or to establish colonies. Military occupation, he notes, will not be effective. He also provides other minor advices, which include the fact that prince should weaken the stronger neighbors and should be on good terms with the weaker ones, and that princes should always act to solve problems before problems fully develop themselves, and that rulers should only attempt to acquire more territory with sufficient ability in such regards, and that one can never really fully escape a war, and that a war can only be postponed to the enemy's advantage, and that one should really face the war directly. From chapter 6 to 10, he transitions on to the different ways of acquiring new principalities. He notes that in general, princes should always strive to imitate the examples set by the past great rulers. He then goes on to discuss the 4 different ways for princes to acquire states. First way, which is through their own prowess, he notes that it is a very difficult method. But again, it'll be easier to maintain control over the nation. 2. His own good fortune, which is weak not only because of the fact that fortunes are weak and unstable, but also because they have a weak governing foundation. And 3. Criminal acts. If a prince comes to power by killing citizens and betraying friends, Machiavelli notes that he will be able to achieve power, but never glory. 4. Constitutional principalities. Princes must practice benevolence in this case to retain the people's friendship, as they can serve as protection from the hostile nobles. From chapter 11 to chapter 14, Machiavelli moves on to discuss military matters. Quote, "A prince must have no other objective, no other thought, nor take up any profession but that of war." Machiavelli notes, maintaining defenses and fortifications are as important as keeping an army of size and of strength, and that adequate defensive preparations will inspire people with patriotism and enthusiasm during enemy attacks. He further corroborates that good laws are representative of a good army and vice versa, and that, therefore, a good army is the foundation to the expansion of a state. He notes 3 different types of armies. 1. The prince's own troops, which he notes are essential for a secure principality, and 2. Mercenary troops, which he states they're not effective, have low morals, and cannot have its ambition suppressed. And lastly and third, auxiliary troops, which he notes they fight well, but their first loyalty is to the power of another, which should be a concern to the prince. From chapter 15 to chapter 21, Machiavelli discusses the vices and virtues of the prince. He argues that discussions of the correct behavior of the prince should take on a practical rather than theoretical rules. He mentions that holding all of the qualities deemed good by others is unrealistic, noting that the primary job of the prince is to safeguard the state. Vices are only truly evil if they endanger the state, but when they are employed for the proper interest of the state, the condemnation should not really influence the act. Quote, "Of all the things you must guard against, hatred and contempt come first, and liberality cleaves to both." He notes, generosity is self-defeating. Generosity uses up resources and prevents further generosity. He also notes, excessive compassion creates an atmosphere of disorder to the disorders of crime. Some measures of cruelty is necessary to maintain order. But prince must be careful in his exercise of cruelty, tempering it with the quote, humanity and prudence. He also asks whether being feared or loved is preferable. Though being both loved and feared is ideal, it is much better to be feared. This is because men are ungrateful and are anxious to flee danger, and when remote danger becomes real, some loyals will turn against their prince. When inducing fear, however, a prince must be careful to avoid inducing hatred. He must make sure that all executions are properly justified. Though to keep one's army disciplined and united, there's nothing like too much cruelty. Often quoted line, anyone compelled to choose will find greater security in being feared than in being loved, comes from here, and from Machiavelli's main point, the fact that the quote was taken a bit out of context can be elided. A prince must broke his promises when they put him at a disadvantage, and the reason for which he made the promises no longer exist. A prince should be a master of deception. A prince should present the appearance of being a compassionate, trustworthy, kind, and pious ruler. Of course, actually possessing all these virtues is neither possible nor desirable. But so long as a prince appears to act virtuously, most men will believe in his virtue. A prince should defend against foreign enemies with a strong army and good allies, and in internal insurrection by making sure that he's not hated. This is a powerful defense against conspiracies, as conspirators require the support of many people, risk punishment, and who can profit greatly by informing the prince. Whenever possible, a prince should delegate the administration of unpopular laws to others and keep in his power the distribution of favors. He should make it a priority to keep the powerful satisfied. Arming subjects foster loyalty among the people and defends the prince. Disarming subjects will breed distrust, which leads to civil animosity. Thus, one way they can enhance their stature is to cunningly foster opposition that can be easily overcome, but also that reveals the motives of potential conspirators. Furthermore, fortresses are only useful as long as he's not being hated by his subjects, and therefore a prince must make sure that he's not being hated by his subjects. Nobility, he notes, can be achieved by the grand public display of rewards and punishments. Above all, the princes should win reputation for being a man of outstanding ability. A prince should encourage his citizens to excel in their occupations and to live their lives in peace. And also, the prince should reward those who contribute to the state's prosperity. From chapter 22 to the end of the book, he discusses ministers' advices in freeing Italy. He notes, a prince should be able to possess the ability to appreciate another person's ability to understand things. Good ministers should be rewarded to maintain their loyalty. A prince must always seek advice, but a prince should allow only wise advisors to speak with him, and only when he specifically requests their advice. He should also be always skeptical of his advice. He also notes, military faults and depending upon others for security were the cause for a prince to lose his states, and gives his concluding remarks that Lorenzo is currently Italia's best hope and has the greatest opportunity to redeem and unify Italy. There's two main notable things about his writing style. First of all, he has a distinctive pragmatic style. His pragmatic style incorporates direct realism, which is very contrary to the books of his time and to the philosophers of his time. And this is what really earned him his reputation. Another important detail here is his use of analogies. One of the most significant components of his argument style is his use of definition by division, which is a rhetorical device. This device can be described schematically as a prince must accomplish X, and there's methods A, B, and C to achieving X. A is preferable to B and C, and therefore the prince should choose the method A. This is a logical and practical line of reasoning, but if the original assumption that A, B, and C are the only solutions to this problem is fallacious, then all the conclusions that follow are necessarily questionable. Then, the course of action that Machiavelli proposes for a prince is not necessarily the best possible option, and this is really just a distinctive part of his argument style. As for the controversial book, there are many different interpretations of the book that many different scholars suggest, which among the most popular is the Republican one. There's two main Republican interpretations. First, the weak Republican interpretation suggests that Machiavelli, despairing the future of Florence, saw Medici as the only alternative to total chaos. But however, we can see that this argument sustains credibility as it underestimates Machiavelli as a citizen and a theorist of the Florentine Republic. The strong Republican interpretation, on the other hand, denotes that he remained a strong defender of Republican liberty and an opponent of the Medici. Rossio, a prominent scholar, suggested that this book was meant for Republicans and was not meant for the Medici at all, but rather to expose to the people the brutal ruthlessness of the princesses and lay bare their methods and madness. But a counter argument to this interpretation often is that he never really intended this book to be in publication, and even more for Republicans to read it. According to records, he only sent it to Francesco Vettori, his only contact in the Medici palace. Shelton Wolin, another prominent scholar, suggested that this book should be taken literally. The heroic politics made possible by the heroism of the virtuous leader. The prince will render himself superfluous and therefore give way to the rise of mass politics in the Republic. And he will also create institutions that will subsume and outlive him. But however, we can see that there's really no advice concerning the Republican institutions, and this book even barely deals with republics at all. How would Machiavelli then truly imagine them fit subjects for heroic politics then? The notion that the prince is what it pretends to be, a scientific manual for tyrants, has to contend not only against Machiavelli's life, but against his writings, as of course everyone wants to use the prince as a centerpiece in an exposition of Machiavelli's political thought. This is the central argument of the satire interpretation. If we take the prince as an objective scientific depiction of political reality, we must face contradiction not only by what we know of Machiavelli's political career, of his usual opinions, and of his usual literary skill, but also by the facts of history as reported by, among others, Machiavelli himself. There's mainly four arguments that this interpretation suggests, and the first one being that the proposition asks us to believe that Machiavelli directly wrote a handbook meant to help a tyrant rule the once free people of Florence. We can see from Machiavelli that he had a great sense of patriotism. Furthermore, Machiavelli retired from public life as poor as when he had first entered it, which was quite a unique feat in his state. It was more of a very rare one. These two examples suggest that Machiavelli would strongly love Lorenz, and that definitely not write a handbook meant for a tyrant rule the free Florence. And B, that his true acceptance of tyranny seems impossible from this chronological point of view. I suppose it is possible to imagine that a man who has seen his country enslaved, his life works wrecked, and his career and with his own career with it, and has for good measure been tortured within an inch of his life, should thereupon go home and write a book intended to teach his enemies the proper way to maintain themselves, writing all the time, remember, with the passionless objectivity of a scientist in a laboratory. He still lingered in Florence after Lorenzo de' Medici took power. He was arrested, imprisoned, and interrogated. 4 times of the rack were usually enough to break a man, body, and spirit, but Niccolo Machiavelli endured 6, and well enough to congratulate himself afterward, not just on his survival, but on his courage. He admitted nothing during the investigations, and since nothing could be proven against him, he was released with no further punishment than the loss of his office, a large fine, and exile to his tiny estate 7 miles from the gates of Florence, there to eat his heart out in loneliness and boredom. Machiavelli emerged from prison in mid-March 1513. Most people believe that the prince was finished by December in the same year. And C, that Machiavelli greatly preferred republics, according to his other books, and D, that this book suggested Lorenzo is a tyrant. The shock was intensified again, because Machiavelli deliberately addressed himself primarily to princes who have newly acquired their principalities and do not owe them either to inheritance or the free choice of their countrymen. The short and ugly word that's been prevalent for this kind of prince in Europe is tyrant. Machiavelli never quite uses this word except in illustrations from the classical antiquity, but he seems to delight in dancing all around it, until even the dullest of his readers could not mistake his meaning. Opinions about the relative merits of republics and monarchies varied during the Renaissance, depending mainly on one where lived, but about tyrants there was only one opinion. Another interpretation seems to be that this book was meant to be as a trap for Lorenzo de' Medici. This interpretation suggests that advices on where to live, how to behave, and whom to arm are foreign to malintent. They provide several examples. First of all, on where to live, Machiavelli offers the prince, in a formally free state, 3 choices: to spoil, to live within, or to restore the freedoms of the occupied city. He then, providing historical examples, advocates the second option as the only result: to live within the city, on page 19. Yet this is contradictory. In chapter 5, he states that whoever becomes a ruler of a free city and does not destroy it can be expected to be destroyed by it. Rebellions against the prince, he argues, will always be found in the name of liberty, which republican citizens will never cast aside. Machiavelli's advice seems to be designed to change the residential practice of the family by strategically placing the prince within the city's wall. Yet, at the same time, it seems to run counter to his warning about the vengeful nature of former republicans. And on how to behave, he repetitively advises that the ruler should always strive to gain the favor of the people, which was the theme mainly brought up in chapter 9, and because the friendship of the people is the prince's main resource in times of adversity, he must avoid incurring their hatred in order to ensure about conspiracy or ruin, on page 67. Yet he acknowledges that princes cannot always avoid being hated by someone, noting that it is best if those who hate him not be the people. The people provide a far firmer foundation for power. This is contrary to the advice he gave to Pope Leo. Warning against liberality in the prince is more of a matter of a Republican sympathy than helpful advice. Medici's liberality is what garnered people's support. Instead, he aims to deprive Lorenzo of a successful tactic that his family used for ages. And on whom to arm? Machiavelli argues the new prince who disarms his subjects offends them and generates hatred towards himself. Therefore, he concludes, a new dominion always has its subjects armed. History is full of examples. On page 78. His suggestion that granting of arms inspires loyalty and makes partisans out of subjects, if taken to be sincere, fails to account for the possibility, indeed probability, that arms may also facilitate plots, excite insurrection, and inspire rebels. But yet, personally, even though this sounds plausible, I think there's a major problem with this interpretation. Why would he intentionally include such contradictions inside the same book if he were to try to really just trick the prince? Wouldn't he read the contradictions? Wouldn't that undermine the argument for trapping the prince? And I think that's really just the biggest counter-argument for the trapping the prince interpretation. In The Prince, Machiavelli really got me struck into three noteworthy points. First of all, the book really gives very valuable advices that's very relevant to the corporate world and governments nowadays. For example, Machiavelli gives the advice that military occupation is bad. I mean, the U.S.'s recent failures in the Middle East can corroborate that. Also, there's more advices about preemptive strikes, importance of reliable intelligence, importance of discipline in the military, and much more that still remains very relevant to this day. And second of all, they have historical analogies. Moses, Romulus, Cyrus, Athenian, Sparta, and the kingdom of Darius. And a lot of these historical contexts and examples really help you not only to understand the book better, but to understand these historical events just much better. And also, this book would provide greater insight to Machiavellianism. Those were mainly the strength of the book, but there's still limitations. According to the research, more than 10 monographs and several articles were published in the 90s, having specifically attempted to provide corporate executives with advice derived in part or whole from Machiavelli. After time passed, dozens of manuals had appeared and colleges began adopting these texts as required reading. Scores of universities and business schools now offer courses that feature Machiavelli or one or more of the authors discussed below. Machiavelli's relevance to the modern management and corporate leadership seems significant. Teaching of these manuals are either inconsistent with the actual teachings of Machiavelli or fail to acknowledge the teachings of Machiavelli most relevant to the corporate world. The main problem is that his advice was designed for lawgivers. Machiavelli's ethics might serve the interest of certain executives and corporations, but a corporation adopting such an ethic is less likely to be successful and it would likely have a more reduced lifespan. And for me, I think personally, there's more to the book than his direct and alluring advices. His examples, the reasoning process, and his observations, and some of these which can still be applied. But there's still a lot of advice which are outdated or which really can't be like used in this day, or which are really just frequently misunderstood a lot. But again, in the larger context of today, I think failures of ethics in the business community has been a problem of late with Enron, Tyco, WorldCom, in Philadelphia, and a handful of brokerages, houses, and banks in like situations like the subprime mortgage crisis. And I think the focus on greed is like the cause of all these issues. But again, Machiavelli probably haven't really realized the book could get this famous to this day, and everyone would read it still in the modern world. But personally, I'd give this book overall a very high thumbs up, and I personally like to recommend this book to everyone interested in politics or in power dynamics. Because the book, first of all, describes power dynamics and effects of human desires very well. The book thoroughly has, though with limitations, very good adaptations. Majority of his advices are still worthwhile today. And also, this book really breaks the prejudice of viewing Machiavelli as evil. And also, since history always repeats, there's nothing bad about learning about all these historical examples and how Machiavelli saw these historical events. A few more thoughts here. I've also got a lot out from this book. What humanist Italy was like, how Machiavelli was the man of the time, and like his observations and pragmatic advices really got me thinking deep about what a prince should really pursue, and like what Machiavelli thought the common pitfalls in the prince's war, and like dynamics of power. Also, I also like first read this book with the popular concept of it being an evil book, but now that I've finished it and read it repetitively like multiple of times, I feel like it's not exactly evil. There's very more to the book than just simply the book being evil. I'm also personally interested in economics and business, and I think with good translations to the modern world, advices here are time-lasting, high-quality ones, and there's just way more to the book than that. And I really like enjoyed the book over the last month, and I like to really urge all of you to like give the book a try. Thank you.